what is fatigue? I always struggle to define it and how it is different to being tired.
I think that's a really important question. And in fact, you're not the only one who asks it. When I put in grant applications on fatigue, sometimes the panel will ask exactly the same question. So fatigue is a serious symptom in a lot of inflammatory conditions. So MS, it seems to be particularly prevalent, but also in other diseases like inflammatory bowel disease, kidney disease, it is one of the major symptoms people struggle with. I think it's very frustrating for people who have fatigue in the context of these conditions, in that often people say, oh, well, I also feel fatigue, but it is more than the usual tiredness. If you look at the descriptions people give you, it'll be like, I've got 2 children hanging on each of my legs and I'm trying to walk. So it's a very extreme form of fatigue. It's a fatigue that's not necessarily related to exertion. So, all of us, if we've worked really hard all day, or we've just done a 10-kilometer run or whatever, we might feel fatigued. But you can feel fatigue in MS regardless of, so it can get worse when you've done those things, but it's not necessarily relieved by rest, and it's not necessarily related to exertion. Other people also talk about brain fog, but I liken it a little bit, having traveled a lot, to when you have jet lag. You have that feeling where you can't necessarily retrieve a word, you can't get clarity of thought, and then suddenly it feels like a sledgehammer's hit you and you just want to go to sleep. And I that's kind of how I envisage it a little bit.
So in terms of treatments then, or strategies or different things to do with what's going on?
So it's important to note that firstly, there's no particular drug that seems to work very well in MS fatigue. So they've trialed various drugs. Overall, if you look at the effects of drugs, they're minimal. The interventions that seem to work best are exercise interventions. And this doesn't mean you should rush out and exercise on your own. That's not what we're saying here. But the one that seemed to be particularly important was balance. Now, again, we've got to be cautious with that because the studies on balance weren't necessarily particularly large studies and they weren't particularly well conducted, some of them. So we always say that the overall evidence is still a little bit poor, but balance did seem to be quite important. So if you think about it, if you have MS, and balance is an issue for you, you're using quite a lot of your energy just getting around potentially and so forth. And so improving balance might improve fatigue. The next highest in terms of our analysis was cognitive behavioral therapy. This is cognitive behavioral therapy for fatigue specifically. So it's around trying to change the things that are making the fatigue worse. And so one of the things that we know makes fatigue worse is having a very erratic routine, or particularly an erratic sleep-wake routine. So it's a bit like, we talked about the jet lag. Yeah. You have a very erratic sleep-wake routine, then you almost keep your system in a state of jet lag quite a lot.
Because it's invisible as well, so at work or with friends, I find it difficult to explain. Is there any approaches or how to describe it in a different way?
I think you can also use some of the evidence to say, so for instance, we've just done a survey on the MS registry in the UK, and we haven't got all the data together, but we found that 90% of people, I think of the over 4,000 that we surveyed, experience fatigue as a symptom of MS. When we look at the data, fatigue is the most commonly cited reason that people stop working with MS. So, you can use information like that. This is not normal fatigue. This is not just tiredness. This is a very extreme symptom. I think if you just say fatigue, most people will say, who doesn't feel fatigue?
Yeah. What is happening for it to affect your cognition and not just your energy levels?
So there's 2 ways to think about cognition, or the way we talk about it in psychology. So cognition is usually when we're talking around your attention and your memory. Those are your kind of main cognitive functions, or what we sometimes call your working memory, which is when you're doing things in your head. So, if I said to you, I want you to work out how to get from here to a shop, you can work that out in your head. You get like a mental map of the directions that you're going to need to work. That's what we call working memory. There's the space in your brain where you can kind of work things out. And we do know that is affected in some people with MS. So again, depending on where the inflammation, where lesions can go, people sometimes have slowed information processing. So the speed at which they can take things can be affected by the MS itself. So that becomes one of the primary factors. We know when we look at physical and mental fatigue, when we measure them, there's a lot of overlap. If you're having to expend more energy concentrating on how to do things, then that uses some of your attentional capacity.
The symptoms of MS can manifest in countless ways. Everyone's MS is different. Early intervention is key. MS can cause symptoms beyond your control. Don't blame yourself. MS is not your fault. Thanks so much for watching. For more content on MS, from treatments and diagnosis to mobility and sex, check out the rest of MS 101.